Hello, everyone. This is Kaushik Zubair with the KZ Show. The objective of the show is to transform lives by sharing ideas that inspire action. In today's show, we'll be looking into what racism is and how we can be anti-racist. We have with us Angie Abdulkader, who is a scholar, researcher, and educator with Rutgers University. Our second panelist is Michael Boyer. He is the CEO at Boys and Girls Club of Mid Central Coast. Also, Michael is the founding director of Diversity Coalition of San Luis Obispo, California. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. So let's start the conversation. And if you can break it down for our audience, the distinction between bias, racism, and systemic racism.
I think first we have to realize what racism is, right? And it really refers to a prejudice, and really adding socialized power to that prejudice, and that's really what racism is. And we can get into a lot of the details of racism, but it's really thinking that a person that has specific biological attributes is inferior to another type of person that has specific biological attributes, right? And so some people might think that me as a Black American are biologically inferior to white Americans. Some people might have that thinking, and we would call that racism.
Sure. So I think that, the concepts of bias, racism, and systemic racism are all interrelated, although somewhat distinct. So for me, bias I would conceptualize as some sort of prejudice that's directed at an individual on account of a protected aspect of their social identity, such as their gender or their race or their ethnicity or their religion or their immigration status, so on and so forth. And then racism, I think, is a manifestation of that bias, whereby an individual is confronting or experiencing oppression on account of their race, real or perceived, by the individual who's harboring this prejudice or hostility. And then systemic racism, I conceptualize as institutionalized racism. And what I mean by that is that essentially it's racism that manifests in the context of institutions. And those could be governmental institutions, those can be educational institutions, just in an institute, medical institutions, so on and so forth. And so I think that is, generally speaking, the relationship between those three concepts. I think what's important, though, to highlight is that oftentimes when we speak about racism, we do so with this underlying assumption, which I think is misguided, that racism is confined to this Black-white binary, that really it's only African Americans who experience racism, when in reality, if anything, racism can be experienced by a whole spectrum of individuals, including Asian Americans, Latinos, Arab Americans, South Asians, so on and so forth. And so I think that it is important to recognize that when we are talking about racism, that is not confined to this Black-white spectrum, although that's a significant part of it, but rather that racism can occur even between minorities, right? You can have an Arab American who's racist or harbors racism towards Asian Americans, or Asian Americans that harbor racist, ideas or stereotypes towards Latinos, and Latinos that harbor, racist stereotypes and sentiments towards, others. And so I think it's important for us not to confine our understanding of racism to that white-Black binary, because it actually oversimplifies the phenomenon. And I think that if we want to think critically about transformational change and how to address the scourge of racism, we need to open up our minds to the spectrum of ways that it actually manifests in our society around us.
I agree. And I think that, on that same point, we also have to make sure that we tell stories that are relatable to the people that we're trying to educate, right? The people that are going to be there in the transformation process. I think people like us, the three of us here, can tell our personal stories and how it relates to racism and how it relates to systemic racism and how we've been affected by those things. And that even takes us further into understanding those, the critical thinking that you're speaking of. It takes us further into really influencing others to think about anti-racism.
It's definitely, it surprises me, and especially what we have gone through during the last year is that racism exists to the degree that we observed it last year. And what are the mindsets and behaviors behind it?
Well, I mean, we can talk about.
There may be multifaceted mindsets and behaviors that inform prejudice or discrimination or what you're referring to as racism. And oftentimes they may be entrenched in just misinformed stereotypes of various groups that are generalizing behaviors to an entire racial, ethnic, or other racialized group, as opposed to judging individuals on account of specific characteristics. So, for example, there are stereotypes of African Americans as being violent or suspect. There are stereotypes of Muslims Arabs and South Asians who've been racialized as being suspicious and fundamentalist and radical. There are stereotypes of Latinos as being criminals and gang members and rapists, and so on and so forth. And so I think that when you refer to mentalities or the behaviors, I think that it's stereotypes that may in fact inform conscious or unconscious biases that individuals have towards others. So as opposed to judging an individual and coming to conclusions on the base to their specific behaviors and conduct, that we paint an entire group with a broad paintbrush, assuming that these characteristics are specific only to that group. And so I think that's a problematic aspect of the mentalities that you're kind of referring to. Sometimes that's a result of ignorance, and sometimes it's more malicious, I think, than that, as we've seen in our own country in recent years. So I think those are my initial observations in response to that question.
Yeah, I think some of the mindsets really also, I completely agree, but I also think that we have to realize that some of the systemic racism that we discussed earlier has created some of the ignorance to push forward racist mindsets and behaviors into our modern times, right? I mean, if you look at history books from elementary school kids and high school kids, it really has been whitewashed throughout the last 70 to 80 years, and even before then. But it really comes down to a situation where we have many generations of folks in our society that actually don't even know about other people of other ethnic backgrounds. And that ignorance in and of itself really creates fear and helps spread those mindsets and behaviors.
So you talked about some of the history. Can we share some of the history that helped create those mindsets?
Yeah, I think, I mean, it really comes down to a situation where our society talks about these great achievements in civil rights, right? They talk about these things as though they're complete, as though we checked off that box, right? But our society doesn't continue to, because of many systemic racist issues across our institutions and government, doesn't have the wherewithal to continue to understand that it's actually, from those time frames, it continues to get worse and worse and worse for all people who aren't white in our society. And I really think from a historical standpoint, we need to educate our populace on what I refer to as real American history that involves all ethnic origins and all heritages within our country, not just Caucasian and European heritages.
And when we look at
so I would
yeah, go ahead.
If I can, to add to the conversation regarding history by drawing sort of on more recent examples of history in an American context, particularly since we're speaking about systemic racism. So as I noted earlier, when we refer to systemic racism, we're really referring to racism that arises in institutional contexts. And I also noted that it's not confined to black-white binary. And so, a really interesting example of this is actually the realm of counterterrorism, for example. So in the United States, according to research from reputable think tanks, since 1994, there's actually been more terrorist attacks and plots carried out by right-wing extremists than any other group on U.S. soil. And since 2002, there's actually been more deaths perpetrated by right-wing extremists and white supremacists than any other group. And yet, according to former FBI officials, approximately 80% of the FBI's resources are actually devoted to addressing the threat from real or perceived international terrorists versus the domestic terrorism within. And so that's an example of systemic racism, because the empirical evidence actually demonstrates that the greatest national security threat to the United States of America for decades has consistently emanated from right-wing extremists and white supremacists. And yet, in terms of the resources law enforcement officials have actually devoted to addressing that threat, it's not proportional, right? The resources have not proportionately allocated to address those threats. And so that's an example of the manifestation of systemic racism, because what we see is there's a prioritization of the threat from quote unquote radical Islam, as well as from quote unquote Black identity extremists, right? This is not necessarily a new phenomenon. We saw how even during the civil rights movement, civil rights icons such as Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and others were consistently targeted by law enforcement officials as being a formidable threat to the United States for no other reason than because they were activists who were challenging the status quo. And because they were challenging the status quo, they were considered a threat. And this actually brings me to another element of our conversation when we're speaking about behaviors and mentalities that inform racism or systemic racism is this issue or argument regarding strategic interests. So, there's one argument, which is this is a result of ignorance. And I, as an educator, I can appreciate that argument. And I teach classes, both graduate and undergraduate classes at Rutgers that focus on racism, because I do believe that education is an effective remedy to addressing that ignorance. But I think it would be short-sighted for us not to also recognize that there are strategic interests that are advanced by racist policies and practices, as well as laws. And that has always been the case in the United States of America. And so, and there's an individual, a law professor who's since passed away. His name is Derek Bell, and he was the first African-American law professor at Harvard Law School. And he's also grandfather of this body of scholarship known as critical race theory. And he coined a theory, which he termed interest convergence theory. And it actually speaks to this issue of strategic interest. And his argument was that social change does not occur within society for altruistic reasons. Social change occurs in society when the interests of the majority group aligns with the interests of the minorities advocating for that change. And so to make his argument, he cites to the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education, which is, of course, a landmark US Supreme Court decision that implemented the desegregation of American schools, which is widely heralded. We learn about it in primary school. We learn about it in high school and law school. But we don't learn about his arguments, which is there is a confluence of social, political, and economic factors that informed the Supreme Court decision in Brown versus Board of Education. And I think that's a really critical consideration, particularly when we're speaking about how do we affect change, right now in our midst. We need to, I think, consider how racism can serve strategic interest. And I think we saw that, most prominently in this most recent presidential administration, the Trump administration, and more broadly, the Republican Party, shamefully enough. They use racist rhetoric. They use and advance racist policies for political ends, to win votes. And we saw Trump consistently do this. And again, it goes to, this point about racism not being confined to this black-white binary, because Trump consistently advanced racist rhetoric, racist policies, racist practices that adversely impacted diverse marginalized groups, whether those were Asian Americans, whether it was African Americans, Latinos, Muslim Americans, so on and so forth. The common thread was the oppression, right? Based on that aspect of one's social identity. He didn't distinguish, right? He's kind of an equal opportunity oppressor, Donald Trump. And the Republicans, as he did so successfully, shamefully rallied around him, right? And we saw this phenomenon of Trumpism. Why did the Republicans rally around him, particularly individuals like Ted Cruz, who was such a fierce opponent during those that primary stage in 2015, before he was actually elected the candidate or selected as the Republican candidate in the 2016 presidential elections? Because he did it successfully. He won votes. So there was an interest that was served. There was a strategic interest that his racism served. And unfortunately, rather than demonstrating integrity, rather than showing principle and distancing themselves and condemning this racism, whether it manifested in his rhetoric and his policies and his practices, they aligned themselves with him because it served them politically. And so I think that it would be short-sighted and naive of us if we didn't recognize that aspect to racism. And when we talk about mentalities and behaviors that inform and perpetuate, and why racism, the scourge, continues until today, is because there is a tangible interest that is served by this ideology. And once we start to undermine that interest and make it so that they're not winning the votes, it will continue. And I think we need to have that conversation and recognize it just with all candor, right? That there's a political,
sure.
and I think that it will be more effective in that way.
Wow. No, definitely, that's a great point. So when we look at the general public and people who are who we would consider not ignorant, or people who don't have any special interest in provoking racism, what strategies would you suggest for those people to be a better ally?
So, Michael, did you want to address first? I feel like I've been hogging.
No, go ahead. No, thank you. You're wonderful. You're wonderful.
I'll defer to you. I want to be respectful.
In my mind, allyship really starts with having to understand, really to get to a point where you can be an ally first. I mean, there's just so many things that we can go through. What I really focus on is making sure that people realize, white people realize in general, or anyone who has that there is a problem, that there is something that I mean, when we're talking today, we're talking about people that we here realize the problem, and we have first they need to accept that there's a problem. Really, then they need to be introspective and realize that they have a problem. We all have some racist tendencies, and then they have to create knowledge. They have to learn from people like you two on this this evening. But really, what it comes down to, then they have to have empathy, and they have to then they're ready to be an ally. And really, being an ally is using your privilege to assist others without that privilege, right? So I might have more privilege than another person of a different ethnic heritage, and I should be able to use that privilege to assist them, whether it's making connections, influencing others, being proactive.
Can you share some specific examples of how people with privilege can use their privilege to help BIPOC people?
For sure. I'm the CEO of a Boys and Girls Club. We have 13 clubs. We feed and educate thousands of kids every day, right? Those kids are all of their families qualify for federal lunch programs, right? They all are well under the poverty line. I'm using my privilege to raise money to feed them breakfast and lunch, right? I'm using my privilege to make sure they have an afternoon tutor to ensure that they get the very best education they can, right? And we do it, we do it for free in most cases for these families and these kids. We're trying to create a stepping stone of equity for them, right? And so that's just one example myself. I mean, I have examples of people using their privilege to help me, right? And so it really kind of, if you can step back and realize there's always somebody that you can help. There's always somebody that you can be an ally to.
Angie, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of concur with those sentiments. I think that, allyship is very context specific. But I would say that probably a common thread is to begin with the individual. I think you need to begin with yourself. And part of that involves sort of self-introspection and educating oneself and recognizing your own conscious and unconscious biases. And so to that effect, one book that has had a really profound impact on me is How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram Kendi, which is, a New York Times bestseller, and he's sort of a household name at this point.
Great book.
But one of the reasons that I think it had such a profound effect is because he sort of begins the book, if you haven't read it, with his own sort of personal anecdotes about his own internalized biases towards the African American community. And as an African American himself, I felt that it was really powerful for him to share those insights, especially because I think as a reader, the effect that it had on me is sort of giving permission to acknowledge your own flaws and shortcomings, right? Because if he's African American and he can admit that I have these internalized biases and I've had them since the time I was a child, and I've recognized them, and here's what I do to overcome it, it then gives you an opportunity to sort of to acknowledge your own biases, which I think is so important because there's so much stigma to the concept and word racism, right? And so to actually come forward and say, yeah, I'm a racist. I mean, no one wants to say that. I think he acknowledges this in his book, that everyone sort of pro forma says, yeah, I'm against racism, which I think he tries to take things a little bit further, and say it's not enough to just say I'm not a racist. You need to be an anti-racist, which means that you're actively working to address and counter the scourge of racism, which I think is a really powerful thesis that he forwards. But this idea of giving yourself permission to identify your own conscious or unconscious biases, hopefully through the power of education, right? By reading, there's so many books now that are available like that one, but so many others as well. White Fragility is another one. There's just so many books available online and in bookstores that one can pick up to sort of educate themselves about racism and so in all of its different manifestations and forms. So I think that when we speak about allyship, it's key to sort of start with yourself and to recognize your own shortcomings. And then I think that in terms of how do you actually actively serve as an ally is really context specific, because each of us serves in different roles in our personal lives, in our professional lives, in our spiritual lives. And so depending on the parameters of your role, you'll be presented with different opportunities, right? So as an educator, I may have a role to play in the classroom with my students in terms of how to serve as an anti-racist ally. As a leader within the American Bar Association, which is the largest volunteer organization of lawyers in the United States, I have a role that I can play as an ally by essentially creating spaces for members of other marginalized communities to raise awareness about challenges they're confronting because of aspects of their identity, right? So it's hard for me to translate that more generally, but to sort of recognize that the change begins with yourself, right? You can't change others and stand with others until you look inward and create that change first within yourself.
Okay, let's talk about people. Sorry, Mike. Go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
No, I was going to change it to the people who, today who are facing racism, who are on the other side of the aisle. Like, what strategies would you recommend to them in terms of for them to maintain their physical and mental health? We have looked into there is a race-based trauma theory by Robert Carter that talks about the PTSD and intergenerational trauma due to racism. What advice or guidance would you provide to people who are facing racism today in America?
As you mentioned at the top of the hour, I work at Rutgers University, and one of the classes that I teach there is actually religion and politics. It should probably be retitled Race, Religion, and Politics, because I think race really factors prominently into so many of our discussions. The class looks at the political behavior of various religious groups, but those religious groups have intersectional identities. And so what I mean by that is that when we look at the political behaviors of Protestants, Black Protestant political behavior is somewhat distinct than those who are mainline Protestants, right? And Latino Catholic political behavior is also somewhat distinct from their white Catholic counterparts. What I find really interesting, though, about the Latino Catholics and the Black Protestants, Muslim Americans, and to a similar degree, Jewish Americans, is that they're also among the most religious groups in America. That's particularly true of Black Protestants. They are actually the most religious group in America. And the reason I mention it is because you're asking me about, strategies for coping with racism. And I find that to be really striking, that I feel that faith has traditionally, when you look again from a historical perspective at the African-American experience in the United States, faith has played such a prominent role in terms of combating oppression consistently throughout history. And that's one of the reasons why Black churches have always been under attack by white supremacists, right? Because there's a recognition of that power that the Black church has in these communities, not only in terms of spirituality, but also in terms of the social and political elements, right? The Black church also during the civil rights movement, for example, was a bastion for organizing, for kind of protecting this community, bringing them in, inspiring them. I mean, think about Martin Luther King. He was a pastor, and he drew on his spirituality consistently to inspire and motivate the masses. And so I think even today, I think that being able to sort of draw on that spirituality, whether you're confronting racism as an African American or as a Latino Catholic or as a Jewish American or as a Muslim American, is really important to sort of keeping grounded and keeping things in perspective, and kind of believing and surrendering yourself to a higher being, right? I think there's solace and peace in that. So I that's what comes to mind, to be honest with you. And I think for me, it's really interesting to see that thread in terms of highly religious behavior with these particular groups that have consistently faced oppression.
I agree 100% with that. One thing that I want to just add is from an individualistic standpoint, from looking at individuals in this situation and their stories, and it's pretty much going to be different for each person, right? Obviously, the trends that NG is talking about are very true over history. But when we're talking about people today that are experiencing racism and there's racism in their community, they have to deal with that every day. The advice that I would give is really, it's about how we all can adapt to the communities we live in, adapt to the situation we are in, to be able to take advantage of the allies that we know and the allies that are available to us, to be able to then understand how we influence others, to be able to be, to first of all, to be able to mitigate risks in our lives, right? I mean, personally speaking, I've been assaulted 7 times in my life from various people that don't look like me. And I've learned over time how to spot those situations, right? And I've learned over time not to be in certain places because of those assaults in my past. but most people don't know that stuff, and most people really don't think about that stuff. Now, I would have to say that in general, females know a bit more about keeping safe like that. As I grew up, I just didn't realize it. But as I grew older, I understood that that I shouldn't be caught alone in certain places, for sure. And that's just one piece of advice. There's lots of, from a business perspective, there's lots of pieces of advice. I would have never thought that I would be the CEO of a company when I was in my 20s because of those race things that used to happen to me in the workplace. But somehow I made it.
So as we are talking about the workplace, how does racism impact our corporate culture? What can businesses and corporations can do to eliminate racism within their environment?
So I have, conflicting feelings about corporations. I think that, on the positive side, it was heartening to see that in response to the racial justice protests this past summer and the killing of George Floyd, that there was sort of this mass movement to recruit and prioritize diversity and inclusion and equity initiatives within various corporations. So you definitely saw, I think, an uptick in hiring of directors and associate directors for diversity, equity, and inclusion, which I think is a great, initial step. I think that those individuals need to be given, appropriate resources to create the change that's necessary. Because I think that the next step is obviously various trainings, explicit and implicit biases that can inform workplace culture, interactions, decisions, right, that have a consequential impact on employees, and obviously getting diverse employees in the door, which is important. But by the same token, I found it disheartening to learn about the nature of political donations over the past 4 years. So, arguably, we've had one of the most racist administrations in recent American history. It's not that I am deluded that racism wasn't present in our institutions, government institutions previously, but what was unique about the Trump administration is how unapologetic it was about its racism, right? I mean, I think that was what was sort of, kind of breathtaking about this particular administration. It's not that the racism wasn't there previously, but it was at least politically correct racism, right? Where we need to pretend like we're not racist, right? Come up with code words to communicate our message without being blatant or too offensive about what we're trying to achieve. But Trump made no apologies about his racism. And so the reason why I think this ties in with corporations is because I think that, there's been a series of sort of news coverage about, dozens of corporations from Microsoft to Walmart to Amazon who have consistently over the last 4 years contributed not only to the Trump administration, but to Trump Republicans, including Republicans who spread these conspiracy theories about the 2020 election results. Research shows that most American consumers actually want companies to mirror the values that they have. And so for me to find out, as someone who regularly patronizes Walmart or Amazon, right, that these companies have actively contributed thousands of dollars to Trump and to his cohorts was dispiriting, because in effect they were helping to perpetuate these racist policies, the racist rhetoric, the racist practices that all of these marginalized communities have been victimized over the last 4 years. And so I feel like there's kind of a tension there in terms of, I think it's great that companies are taking the initiative to hire directors and associate directors for diversity and inclusion, projects within, and hopefully that results in more than just cosmetic change. But by the same token, I think the fact that they prioritized their own, this might sound a little bit, naive on my part, but they really prioritize their own corporate, business interests over just common human decency, right? I mean, you're talking about an administration that, supported the caging of children, and
Right.
an administration that bans Muslim and African immigrants for no other reason than because they're Muslim and African. An administration that supported the consumption of Clorox, in response to the coronavirus. And yet you have these CEOs who are quoted, in the New York Times, post January 6th, who are saying, we had to draw the line at the insurrection. And I'm just like, really? Like, this past 4 years,
That's where you chose it?
we're not alarming to you? Like, the caged children, we're not like a red flag that there's something wrong, alarmingly wrong. The sending in of federal, law enforcement officials to brutalize protesters that didn't, over the summer, in response to the murder of George Floyd and other victims of police brutality. That wasn't alarming to you? I mean, it really takes the storming of the U.S. Capitol to kind of, let you kind of think again about whether or not you should be making these political contributions. And so I sort of have, conflicted feelings about the corporations and the role that they have played in perpetuating these regressive policies over the last 4 years. And in terms of who brought us these leaders, because it's one thing say that it's a problem when you think about the fact that so many Americans voted for Trump, or that even that the 2020 elections were as close as they were, right?
Right.
We know that according to the research, more American voters cast their ballot for Biden than any president over the course of American history. But what's disturbing is that Trump earned the second highest votes in American history, right? And it reveals something about where we are as a country, because this was an explicitly racist president. And you would have thought that the American people, after 4 years, would have rejected wholesale that, the abomination of policies and rhetoric that he introduced us to, and yet that's not what we saw. We see a much more fractured and conflicted nation, and the fact that these corporations played a role is something that needs to be explored further.
For sure, and it's really interesting from the large corporation perspective. You're exactly right. I mean, there's definite. There's not a lot of progress that's happening at the large corporation standpoint. I think if we do look at, the majority of the companies that employ individuals across the United States, they're small companies, right? They're companies under $50 million in revenue. And I think those companies also have a challenge. But the interesting thing is, I just have to, it was 10 years ago in April that we had a cross burning here where I live. And that's when we started our diversity coalition, right? And we've been working on these, local policies in local cities for 10 years. And when, this summer happened, yes, it definitely helped the movement. But we're very fortunate to have our message in the hands of local corporations here already. You know, our power company, Pacific Gas and Electric, has supported our, you know, our movement, our city policy changes, and all of those things in this local area. But I think in general, you're right. There's a huge disparity between what corporations are doing, and you know, large corporations are doing, and what the population wants them to do. Definitely.
All right. Most of the people that I have spoken to in general public, when we talk about them, there is, I believe, there is a lack of education on the side of what racism is, and whether they are practicing some or showing some racist traits or not. What would you suggest to them? What would be the initial steps that they need to take? Like, for example, a lot of people of privilege, they say that their response always to racism, I don't see color. To me, everybody is equal, which in itself is a very ignorant statement. And because you basically you are not recognizing the existence of that person, and
Right.
you are seeing that person through the lens of how you see yourself, and you are not seeing what
Right.
how they are being treated in the society. So what would you say to those people?
So, I mean, I think that initially, I would probably just recognize that the sentiment of colorblindness is well intentioned. So I'm not sure that people are necessarily recognize how harmful that concept is. I think what they're really trying to say is, I'm not racist, right? I don't see that someone is African American, or I don't see that someone is Latino or Asian Americans. We're all the same, right? We're all equal. So I think the intention is not necessarily a nefarious one. I think what needs to happen, though, is just sort of an awareness, raising kind of awareness and consciousness about how that concept is harmful, because every aspect of a person's social, political, and economic identity informs their daily experiences and realities. And so when we say that we're colorblind, essentially what we're saying or what we're doing is erasing all those distinctions that inform that specific person's experiences. And so when I say, for example, social, political, and economic realities, you know, an individual who is, who's African American male may have one set of experiences that is distinct from a counterpart who's African American female. And that woman may have a distinct experience than her counterpart who's African American female and an immigrant, who may also have a different experience than the woman who's African American female immigrant living in poverty, right? And so I think that each aspect of our identity helps inform our experiences, and specifically our experiences with oppression, right? Whether that's oppression in economic setting, oppression in a racial setting, oppression in other social or political settings. And I think that, you know, having that conversation can prove helpful. But I think as an initial matter, it's important to recognize that I would say most people who say that are probably well-intentioned and don't realize why that's harmful. Right? They don't realize that it's every aspect of one's identity helps explain their set of experiences. And then once you step back and you recognize that, I think that then creates an opportunity for enhanced empathy, right? You may not be able to identify with all those experiences, but you can then begin to understand why their challenges are distinct from your own, right? And so I think, I think that's important.
So, so most of the people that say that are either saying, it sounds to me what you're saying, are either saying that because they believe that they are not racist, or maybe they're a little defensive, maybe they're, you know, they don't know that, you know, what racism means really. When you come in, I just have a question for us also. When we're talking about white supremacists, or we're talking about the majority in this country, how do we get people to really realize that they don't know everything, that they do need to learn? I mean, there are just so many people in the majority today that believe they already know what they know, and they don't need to learn anything from people like us. I mean, it's really, from my perspective, that's one of the hardest the hardest walls that we come up against, is when somebody comes to me and says, there's no racism. I've never seen it. Right? And you look at them and they're a white male who's affluent. How do you get them to realize that they need to be educated and they're ignorant?
Yeah. I mean, so I think that it's really the answer is probably context specific. I definitely think educational institutions have a really unique and important role to play in terms of educating, particularly because I think research shows that the most impressionable group are really our youth, right? It's that, you know, that sort of college-aged population who are most open to challenging what they think and kind of adopting new ideas and philosophies, whereas the opposite is true of seniors. They're much more entrenched in their viewpoints, and so it can be much more challenging to convince them otherwise. And so I do think that educational institutions, particularly universities, have a role to play. I know that, you know, I've taught, I mentioned earlier, after the ascension of Trump, I designed this class on racism, xenophobia, and intolerance that really explores this diverse ideologies of oppression in a way that they sometimes overlap and intersect, such as anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, xenophobia, so on and so forth. The reason I share it is because I remember after the first semester that I taught it, in my student evaluations, the students actually recommended that it become a required course. And that to me was really revolutionary, because I started thinking to myself, what if undergraduates or even graduate students were required to actually take classes, much like they had, you know, they have kind of to check off boxes in terms of math and science, right? And the humanities. What if they actually had to take a class about you know, racism and tolerance and diversity, and what kind of impact would that have socially in our society? And so that was sort of a train of thought that I sort of entertained at that point, because I really thought it was revolutionary for them to actually recommend that was their recommendation after that class. So I think that, you know, in that context, I do think that educational institutions play a role, but by the same token, education can continue to happen in so many different ways, even after we graduate from formal settings. Right? So, for example, I'm a lawyer by training, and one of the recent movements that's occurring within the legal profession, which I think is really fascinating, is this requirement for lawyers to actually take courses, continuing legal education courses in issues related to diversity and non-discrimination. So by way of background, after you graduate law school, in probably a majority of states around the country, as you practice law, every year you're required to kind of refine your skills and substantive knowledge by taking a certain number of credit hours of courses.
Right.
And you do this as a private attorney. And so just recently, within the past several years, what you're seeing is that the state Supreme Courts are now implementing these new rules that when we take these courses every year, that attorneys are required, attorneys and judges, which I think is really important for the judges, because they have such a profound impact on people's lives, but they are required to take these classes on diversity and non-discrimination and equality. And I think that's really important, the fact that it's mandatory, because I think it speaks to your point about, I think all of us would probably agree that oftentimes the people who most need exposure to these ideas are the ones who are least likely to expose themselves to them, right? Those of us who
Exactly.
and reading it and, you know, tuning into these conversations and willing to kind of challenge ourselves and think differently about, you know, our take on life or people are not necessarily the biggest problem. The biggest problem are the ones who are kind of entrenched in their bigotry and don't want to necessarily expose themselves or don't even realize that they're bigoted in the first instance. And so I think that sort of that mandatory aspect is really important, because you're now forcing people, just kind of like what I was referring to about the college setting. You're kind of requiring people, you're prioritizing it, so you're signaling, you're sending a signal. I think leaders, right, are sending a signal. This is a priority, and we're prioritizing this, which is important, I think, for creating that social change. But I think you're also more likely to affect that change because you're not just kind of preaching to the choir.
So on that note, are there any specific books or podcasts that you would recommend to our audience to listen to or read?
So I know that I mentioned one earlier, which is Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Antiracist, which I think has had a profound impact, not only on me. I assign it to all my students for my class, but also I think on America. The fact that it's a New York Times bestseller, he is, you know, widely hosted at universities around the country, has started his own center at Boston University. But I highly recommend his book. I think also the work by Kimberly Crenshaw. She's a professor at both UCLA Law School and Columbia Law School. She is sort of the also a godmother of critical race theory, and coined the theory of intersectionality, this idea that our experiences are informed by the intersection of different aspects of our identity, the fact that, you know, what our race is, what our gender is, our immigration status, so on and so forth. So her work, I think, is really powerful as well. I think White Fragility by Dr. D'Angelo, who's a sociologist, is really powerful and alarming, because I think it raises awareness about white privilege and the way that it manifests, which is eye-opening and somewhat and distressing. So those are the ones that come to mind. But like I said, I think there's so much. There's so much available. You just need to prioritize it and avail yourself of it.
Yeah, I read those books this last summer, and they're amazing. I also read books like White Too Long, The Legacy of White Privilege in America, but really understanding, I wanted to really read about how it all started, right? And there's just so many books out there that will just go into depth about, you know, white supremacy and the whole Republican movement in our country. You know, the current Republican movement in our country.
Okay. You both, as we are coming up to the hour now, you both work in this environment, and specifically in this area of DEI. What are your personal short-term and long-term equity goals that you want to achieve in your lifetime?
That's a great question. You know, that's one of the reasons why I work at the Boys and Girls Club, is so that we can we can have growth in our region to hopefully be able to serve all the kids that need us most in this region. Right now, we only serve about 10% of the kids. But it really comes down to a situation where we have mostly Hispanic families and kids here that need after-school help, that need food, and some of my goals are really to be able to not just serve 10% of those kids in our local region here in California, but serve 100% of those kids.
Angie?
Yeah, I mean, so by way of background for those who are listening who aren't quite sure what equity is, the difference between equity and equality is this idea of treating everybody the same way, irrespective of their circumstances. Or experiences, whereas equity is much more an individualized and context-specific response, which is, giving people resources according to their specific set of circumstances, which is much more relevant and effective, irrespective of whether we're talking about racial equality or gender equality, or just other historic oppressions that have occurred for different groups. And so I think for me as an educator, I try to achieve equity with my students, particularly, so as an example, is kind of a mundane example, but I might assign, a documentary viewing for a class where it's interesting because it'll involve the purchase of a documentary from Amazon, and maybe that documentary costs $6. And it's, I think, an interesting kind of, for me, a lesson on privilege, because then I'll get the student who comes to me and tells me that they can't afford that. And so I think that, then there's, first there's this kind of consciousness awareness where I'm just like, okay, like, to me, it doesn't seem like a big deal for someone to, to spend $6 purchasing a documentary because everybody's spending other money to purchase books and whatnot. But that's kind of a reality check in terms of the economic diversity and status that I have in my class. But then an equitable response is that rather than penalizing that student for not being able to complete the assignment, because we're all in an online environment because of the pandemic, is by giving them an opportunity to make a different contribution given their specific circumstances. So I really think, again, in terms of equity, it sort of ties in with some of the other conversations we've had during this discussion, which is just really context specific, and you kind of have to look at what your role is, either personally, professionally, spiritually, and how can you realize equity in the lives of others.
Okay. And last question, any specific advice that you would give to people who want to be an ally, who want to see racism eliminated from our society? What piece of advice would you give to them?
So I would, one of the things, oftentimes when we speak about racism or discrimination and prejudice, we think of it in sort of these very dramatic terms, right? So the murder of George Floyd, for example, and other victims of police brutality, or the disproportionate impact of the coronavirus on certain marginalized communities like the African American, Latino, and Native American community, or discrimination in schools with respect to bias-based bullying. But I guess a point that I would like to highlight is that I also think that racism and prejudice happens in the least extraordinary ways as well. So it happens when we're sitting in a car and a Latino man or an African-American man walks by and we lock the doors without any other reason their racial and ethnic identity. It happens when we're sitting and waiting to board an airplane and we start having negative thoughts because we see a Muslim American woman wearing hijab sit next to us, or a Muslim American man with a long beard and conspicuously religious identity looks like he's going to board that plane with us, and so we start to feel anxious. It happens when we don't interview individuals because their names sound too foreign for employment. It happens, according to academic research, we tend to view white men as more credible than African American men who have the same exact credentials. So, for example, if I'm watching a TV show and a white male is advancing a certain position, the research shows I'm more likely to be persuaded by him than his African American counterpart who has the same exact professional and academic credentials. And what's striking is that you're not consciously necessarily engaging in discriminatory thought process. All of these sort of examples oftentimes are a product of unconscious and implicit biases that we have. And so I think it's really important to recognize not only the dramatic ways that racism and prejudice and discrimination manifest in society around us, but also the really mundane, ordinary ways that it manifests as well, because that too has to be addressed. And when we address it, we begin with ourselves. And in my classes, I have this exercise. Harvard University has an implicit bias project. It's this testing how do we figure out what our unconscious biases are, right? So they have this series of tests that you can take, and it just lasts for a few moments, and it's really diverse. What are my biases with respect to Arab Americans or African Americans or Latinos, so on and so forth. And then, they score it instantly, and it gives you some feedback in terms of what your unconscious biases are. And so I do this when I teach this class, and it'll be interesting for me to see the students who are just like, I did well, I have no unconscious biases. And I'll be like, you missed the point of this entire exercise, because we all have unconscious biases, right? And you can't even begin to change those around you until you have an honest, candid, kind of self-reflective session with yourself and just be like, I got some issues I need to work on, right? Whatever those issues are, right? It might be towards immigrants, it might be towards Latinos, it might be, it's fine. But I think realizing that these unconscious biases exist is really important. And then just realizing that the change begins within. We can't change everybody around us, you change yourself. And then by changing yourself, you start to see the ripple effects around you. So that would be my final concluding thought.
All right.
Yeah, we have to confront those racist ideas within us, right? Because we all hold them. And I agree 100% with that. I think that once people realize that there is then they need to have some acceptance and to really confront those issues. I think people really need to stop saying I'm not a racist, right? They have to stop telling themselves that, and they have to realize that there are parts of them that are, and to address those parts as clearly as possible. That's the first step.
Yep. Thank you so much, Michael and Angie, with this conversation. It is definitely a very challenging topic that that we have to address. Like whether it's corporate America or in our private lives, we have to raise children who are anti-racist, because at the end of the day, it's our society. It's a society where our next generations are going to live. And if we don't look at ourselves internally first, as we mentioned, and identify the traits that we need to eliminate from our thinking process, our society is not going to be better. So it's our individual responsibility to make sure that whatever we are building today would bring a better world tomorrow. Thank you so much to our listeners. Thank you for being on this.
Thank you.
Thank you.